Welcome to the Beyond 6 Seconds podcast. I'm your host, Carolyn Keel, and on today's episode, I'm speaking with Dr. Daniel P. Jones, a creative practitioner, disability scholar, and postdoctoral research associate at the University of Sheffield in the UK. Daniel specializes in inclusive research methodologies, focusing on the embodied experiences of public spaces, kinship, and solidarity within Tourette syndrome communities. As someone who has lived experience of Tourette syndrome himself, he has been actively engaged in community facilitation and Tourette syndrome activism in the UK for over a decade. Daniel has also contributed to a diverse array of visual and performance artworks that highlight the lived experiences of those with Tourette syndrome, and works collaboratively with scholars, activists, charitable organizations, and arts collectives to facilitate conversations and educational opportunities about Tourette syndrome. Daniel, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm really happy to have you here and to learn more about your story and the type of research that you're doing. So I guess to start out, how did you first realize that you have Tourette syndrome?
Sure. So the earliest kind of instance that I remember kind of ticking was I must have been maybe 4 or 5 years old, and I was at school. I remember I kind of knocked one side of my head like on a table, and I felt like this urge to like balance it out almost. I think that's like the earliest, I guess, instance that I can remember that was probably linked and was probably a tic. And then I guess from there I kind of started developing other tics, so kind of like grunts, other vocal tics like grunts and sniffs and snorts, and other kind of like twitches and things like that. But it was never really something that I was too bothered by until maybe a little bit later on in school, when maybe I was kind of like approaching teenage years. And that's when, I basically went to my parents and was like, this is horrendous. I hate it. I can't control my body. And that's when, I went to go and see a medical professional, got a diagnosis maybe at age 13, 14 or so. And been ticking ever since, I guess.
Wow. Had you heard of Tourette syndrome like before you got your diagnosis, or was this like a really new revelation once you got diagnosed?
My diagnosis is kind of a bit of a strange instance. So I was technically diagnosed with Tourette syndrome, but I didn't realize that I had been given an official diagnosis until a lot later on in life, kind of after my undergraduate degree even. So like I'd gone to the doctor, I'd kind of chatted to like GPs about like chronic tic disorders and Tourette syndrome. So I'd heard from like a GP, I guess, about that. But I guess prior to that, I hadn't really come across Tourette syndrome before. And I guess, as I kind of went through school after kind of getting diagnosed, but not really knowing I was like officially diagnosed, I obviously became more aware of Tourette's and kind of, was realizing that that's probably what I had. And I just didn't realize I'd actually had an official diagnosis. And part of that is because of the way that, the doctor that gave me a diagnosis kind of advised my parents to deal with it, I suppose. And it's still quite common to this day, is that parents of Tourettic children will be told, don't acknowledge the tics, distract your child from their tics, don't really talk about Tourette's, because the more you talk about it, the worse it gets. Oh. And that kind of approach is not great, but it kind of comes out of this place of, if you are aware of tics and, they're having more of an effect, like if you're more aware of them, you're probably going to end up ticking more. So that's kind of where that was coming from, because if you're talking about it, you're like hyper aware of what you're doing. It's kind of this, don't think about an elephant idea, and now, everyone's thinking about an elephant. So that's where that approach came from. But that's why it was a bit of a strange story for me. And that's so I guess prior to then I hadn't really heard of Tourette's, but I guess I kind of discovered what that was on my own after getting that diagnosis. That's, yeah, very roundabout way of saying that, but hopefully that makes sense.
It does. Yeah, I know I've talked with some guests who are autistic, and sometimes when
Yeah.
they're diagnosed early, it can be similar, or at least where
Yeah.
parents are either advised not to tell them or just waiting to tell them at the right time. And
Yeah.
yeah, definitely understand where they're coming from. But yeah, at least around Tourette's and autism, it can be. It's difficult.
For sure. And I think some of that confusion kind of, can be perpetuated by the fact that, especially kind of when I was diagnosed, it must have been like 2009, 2010 maybe, there weren't any, I guess, like interventions as such. There weren't, I mean, there still isn't like a specific medication you can take that works for everybody or whatever. So the way that Tourette syndrome is approached, if you are lucky even, is just to deal with some of the side effects of feeling like anxious or depressed. So I ended up going to therapy, but very much talking about like anxiety and kind of do you have a friendship circle and things like that. Tourette's never even came up in those sessions from what I remember. So yeah, that kind of maybe gives some more context as to the confusion. I thought maybe it was just related to me feeling anxious and depressed, and yeah.
You alluded to this a little bit in that the tics really started to bother you, or you started to become more aware of them in your teenage years. I guess, what was it like growing up with Tourette's? Even though you didn't know it was Tourette's, but we're experiencing it too.
Yeah, I mean, definitely difficult. I think that's nothing, groundbreaking to say, but I think, it started kind of maybe like secondary school. So that's kind of, I guess, like aged in the UK, that's like aged 12 to maybe 16. I guess high school kind of age. I started getting in trouble because I would have tics that certain teachers might have kind of thought I was laughing or kind of like coughing or like pretending to sneeze, things like that, just to be disruptive. I was a very distracted child. I was, very talkative. And so I think that was something that, because, prior to being diagnosed with anything, that hadn't really been on anybody's radars, people assumed it was kind of me behaving poorly, I guess. So that's where these frustrations started to come in. But I think what's also interesting is kind of, I grew up in a very charismatic Christian household. And part of that, why I bring that up, is kind of a few frustrations and, I guess, difficulties I had growing up in that specific environment as somebody who had Tourette syndrome. There was kind of a very common practice at the church that my family was attending to kind of, pray for people to be healed from various illnesses, disabilities, things like that. And kind of laying hands on people and praying for them was not always something that people asked for permission to do first. And so whilst I was very kind of embedded into this kind of church environment, and so I didn't realize the effect that was kind of having mentally, because sometimes I think lots of the response to somebody not being quote unquote healed in those contexts is kind of, there's always some kind of reason. It's either, you have this issue, this illness, this disability for a reason, or another thing that was kind of told to me was, if it's really something that is not meant for you, it's probably because there is someone that you need to forgive. So is there anyone you need to forgive? And then, there were lots of these kind of weird things where then I was, racking my brains thinking, oh God, who am I holding a grudge against? I can't remember. And so there was a lot of those kinds of, I guess, nuanced experiences as well that kind of had that impact on these kind of like frustrations and things as I was growing up. And I was very engaged and kind of embedded in that kind of church community, I guess, honestly until maybe 18 or 19 years old. So yeah, it was definitely something that I don't think I necessarily had the space to reflect on its impact growing up until realistically maybe the last 5-6 years. But yeah, so
Yeah.
very strange. And again, everybody in those contexts was acting in they had my best interests at heart, but I think the combination of not really realizing that I was diagnosed officially with Tourette's, but kind of knowing that I had Tourette's, and then when I had to explain to somebody what was going on, I felt quite strange saying, "Oh, it's Tourette syndrome," because I thought, well, I don't actually have a diagnosis. And then, there were all these kind of different things going on. And so, yeah, a lot going on in my brain to try and, I guess, navigate and kind of, yeah, try to understand as I was trying to come to terms with, I guess, my identity.
Yeah, that is a lot to
Yeah.
really process, and wow. And it's really fascinating that you went from not realizing that you had Tourette syndrome to now your field of study is really around Tourette syndrome research. So that's quite an amazing trajectory there. And
Yeah.
I'm really interested in the things that you studied, because we were chatting about it a little bit earlier, and these were fields that I was not that familiar with. So I'd love to learn more about sort of how you got into this type of research and what it is. And specifically, you were telling me that you study human geography. So
Yes.
I'd love to learn more about that, and then sort of how you apply that to Tourette syndrome.
Yeah. Okay. So human geography, I think until relatively recently, honestly, I don't think I had quite realized, I guess, the extent to which it's a very UK kind of centric idea or kind of discipline. And, it exists elsewhere, but I think, yeah, it's a lot more common to kind of study it even at high school and things. But the way I kind of describe human geography, in short, the most simple way I can kind of explain it is kind of, if you think of history, and we think of history as a discipline that's interested in different processes that are happening in different times, right? If we kind of take that approach, geography is kind of looking at these processes and different processes that happen in different spaces. And it becomes human geography specifically when it's kind of human processes. So I guess there's a lot of crossover with sociology as well. Yeah. But the kind of geographical perspective is that things are often looked at through a framework of space and kind of the idea of places and kind of how people relate to them. I think, yeah, overall the aims of human geography are to, yeah, look at space and place and kind of think about scale, I guess, and kind of the different scales at which different processes happen in these different spaces. And, it's about people and their relationships with their surroundings. And I think the way that I ended up getting into it was quite strange, really. I think I did geography just because at high school, when I was doing GCSEs, I just needed another subject to choose for school. I think I had a space, I had to choose something. I thought, I enjoy this, and at that point I was very much more interested in all the cool things like volcanoes and, evolution and all of that sort of kind of physical, I guess, environmental science kind of stuff. And so I did that. The same thing happened when I went to do college or kind of sixth form and do A levels, which is, just before university qualifications. Again, in the UK, it was common to choose 4 subjects to do. And I had 3 that I wanted to do. And then I thought, hey, I enjoy geography. I'm getting okay grades, let's just put that in there. And then, yeah, it was quite strange. I've ended up almost kind of falling into a geography degree because it's a very broad topic. There's a bit of a running joke in geography that you can study anything because if you translate it, it literally means Earth writing. So you're writing about things that happen on Earth. So, it can kind of be anything. And I think my like indecision of what I wanted to do kind of spoke to geography. So I ended up doing a bachelor's of science in geography at university. And whilst my original focus and interest was in that kind of environmental science, climate change, geology, things like that, the course that I did made everybody, regardless of what their focus was, in their first year take an equal amount of physical and human geography modules. And that is where I started to realize that human geography was, it was more than just looking at demographics and kind of international development and things like that. It was, it could consider things like art and culture and sociology. And so, yeah, I kind of slowly started shifting towards that side of things as you kind of, narrow down your focus at university. And then I ended up being interested enough in it that I did a master's in cultural geography, which is like a sub area of human geography. But yeah, so it's a strange way that I got into that. And then it was in my master's program actually that I remember sitting in like a seminar where we were talking about how bodies interact with different spaces and how the kind of very almost like everyday idea of kind of how bodies move through spaces and how they use them, and the way that it was kind of framed is that all movement is there for a reason. Everything that the human body does, it's reacting to something in a space, and it's, whether you think it or not, it might be a subconscious thing where you might move out the way of someone, or all these different things that was kind of suggesting that every movement, every interaction with a space had purpose. And again, it was at this time I still didn't realize that I had like an official diagnosis of Tourette syndrome, but I would, have told people that I had Tourette's at that point. And yeah, sitting in that seminar, I was thinking, I don't relate to this, because what purpose does this twitch have? What purpose does, me making like a high-pitched squeak have in this context? And at that moment, I would have argued that it doesn't really have a purpose. And so I ended up thinking that might be an interesting thing to do a dissertation on. And actually, this is where I then realized that I actually had a diagnosis, because I was kind of chatting to my supervisor and she was asking about like my approaches, and I said, oh, well, is it ethical for me to like write about my own experiences if I am not actually diagnosed? And then she was like, oh, it's up to you, it's your decision. And I thought, I'm going to see if I can like, go through this process of getting diagnosed. I had like a couple of months to sort it out at that point. Didn't realize that it would have been a much longer process if I hadn't had a diagnosis at that point. Yeah, and I just got an email back from the doctor saying, you were diagnosed in 2009, and at that point it was 2018.
Wow.
Yeah, and so I was like, oh God, like, okay, well, I guess it is ethical for me to do this research, but then obviously that raised a lot of other questions, and yeah, it got me thinking about, I guess, yeah, how my understanding of Tourette's was perhaps different because I hadn't realized that it was something that I had officially been diagnosed with. And so I hadn't necessarily sought out community. I hadn't necessarily sought out treatment or support. I was technically classed as disabled, but I wouldn't have considered myself disabled. I didn't apply for any kind of adjustments that I would have qualified for at university and probably could have done with, to be honest. And yeah, I think all of that together then made me super interested in kind of looking into Tourette's more. And in all honesty, I think it almost became a bit of like a selfish thing where I was like, I'm just going to use this master's degree to kind of figure out who I am and try and understand what on earth is going on. And I think, yeah, and I was doing that kind of looking at specifically, how do people with Tourette's interact with space? And from there, I realized it was a lot bigger than I had realized. And so a few years later, I ended up, applying to do a PhD in it. And I, passed that PhD a month or so ago.
Wow.
And now we're here.
Yeah.
Somehow researching Tourette syndrome still to this day.
That's awesome. Well, congratulations on passing.
Well, thank you.
For
Thank
the past
you.
month or so. That's really cool. Yeah, it sounds like you were really you found this part of the research that was sort of like missing from the discipline of human geography, and were able to start looking into that with your thesis and your research that came after that. So tell me a little bit about your thesis research. I think you told me that you like interviewed some people with Tourette syndrome and kind of got their data in that. What was that like?
Yeah, for sure. So the PhD research that I did focused on specifically the experiences of public spaces that adults diagnosed with Tourette's were having. You know, there's a lot of gaps, I would argue, still in the literature regarding experiences of Tourette's in adulthood, because it's kind of, assumed to be like a something that affects children mostly. And it's quite frankly easier to get funding to research and kind of frame your research as looking to improve the well-being of children than the well-being of adults. It's how it is. It's going to tug on people's heartstrings a bit more. So so that's kind of where that focus came in. And within that, I wanted to look at specifically kind of comparing the experiences had in like physical public spaces. So just kind of like parks, shopping malls, everyday kind of spaces that people use physically, but also compare that to, I guess, digital public spaces, and kind of thinking about things like social media, kind of like online forums, and things like that, and basically try and make a comparison between them. So in order to do that, we had a bunch of like advisory focus groups that I set up in collaboration with a great charity in Hull in the UK called TIC Hull, which is Tourette's Inclusion in the Community, is what that stands for. And we did kind of advisory focus groups where we got people from around the world who have Tourette syndrome, just to chat about Tourette's and kind of try and figure out the exact direction the research was going to go in. So I wanted it to not just be, me writing an entire PhD thesis about my own experiences. I wanted to try and be a bit more objective. As I kind of went on, I realized that's not necessarily a good or a bad thing, but and then from there we did a bunch of interviews as well. I think we had 36 participants that went through a couple of in-depth interviews. And then we also did some zine making and kind of creative, like arts-based workshops with a small group who are based at the charity as well. So a zine, in case, I'm not sure if you're aware of them, but it's kind of, think of magazine, so it's like the last half of that word. And they're kind of self-published, not mass-produced like booklets that are kind of very DIY in nature, kind of very messy, and can have like art and collage and writing and anything you want really in them. And we kind of use that as a springboard to kind of just chatting more about experiences of public space and Tourette's. And I brought all of that data together, so like all this kind of visual data along with the interview and the focus group transcripts, and try to make some kind of coherent argument in this thesis from, a lot of really quite contrasting experiences that people were having. And I think, that the thesis really ended up focusing on this idea of like a sense of belonging and finding community, and kind of, looked at like ideas of kinship and, community and the value of digital spaces. And as I was kind of maybe like a year into the PhD program is kind of when a lot of narratives kind of started coming out in, I guess, in the popular kind of broadcasting media as well as in academic literature about kind of the dangers of social media, specifically looking at Tourette's, this kind of idea of like the TikTok tics, for example, which unfortunately is an approach that people still publish about today. But yeah, so it was just really interesting to see this kind of like demonization of these digital public spaces, and kind of, I guess, this kind of like witch hunt where people were going after specific content creators, saying, you know, oh, I've had 5 people this week come into my clinic and they all watch this person's YouTube videos, and you know, it must be coming from this person. And then there was a whole narrative about spreading Tourette's via social media, which, yes, is as wild as that sounds. And yeah, so kind of halfway through that research period, I saw a really significant shift in the focus of what participants were talking about. Specifically in the UK, a documentary came out that was supposed to be investigating this kind of Britain's Tourette's mystery on like one of the main kind of TV channels over here. And yeah, I think most of the participants that I was interviewing and working with at the time had seen it and had a lot to say about it, you know, how damaging it was and all of these sorts of things. So then, yeah, the digital became so much more fundamental to the thesis. And so I ended up writing a lot about the value of these online spaces for people who otherwise felt like they couldn't really access these physical spaces, specifically adults, because as you turn 18, at least, well, not just in the UK, you know, when you turn 18, you kind of, all service provision tends to just disappear for Tourette syndrome, which is obviously a problem because Tourettic children grow up and they become Tourettic adults, and then they have no support system, no community, and obviously that has negative kind of mental health outcomes as well. So yeah, what I try to do is bring all of these different things together to kind of do a little bit of myth busting, I guess, and kind of, yeah, specifically look at these ideas of I guess belonging and community and kinship in these spaces. And I know that's a very, you know, rambly almost way of explaining it, and you know, although it's finished, I think it's still like this in my head where all these ideas are all over the place. And yeah, so I guess it bodes well for having more to work on in the future. But yeah, I think that sums it up really.
Yeah, no, that's a lot. And it's great that you were
Yeah.
able to talk to people all around the world and get their
Yeah,
experiences, because I would imagine that there are different circumstances, whether it's culture or location or, you know, a whole variety
Yeah.
of things that could impact your experience growing up and living as an adult who has Tourette syndrome. So yeah, that's great. And
Yeah, and I think the culture was so important as well in that, you know, I interviewed and work with a bunch of global majority ethnic folks who have Tourette syndrome. And, you know, as a white man, my experiences are going to be very different. You know, I'm kind of, yeah, as a white man, I'm almost like the stereotypical image of somebody who has Tourette syndrome. But it was really interesting to see some of the other things that were like stopping people going to like physical support groups, you know, if they weren't white. You know, people, I think the most commonly thought of tick is like racial slurs or swearing and things like that, even though, you know, that's not everybody. That is a possibility as a tick. And it was really interesting to see how, you know, global majority ethnic people who have Tourette syndrome were not feeling comfortable, or they were quite concerned and hesitant to go to any physical support group space, because even though they might know that these are tics, that can be really triggering for them. And so these online spaces are the only spaces that they feel safe within and are comfortable within. And so, yeah, I would have loved to have done more work on that sort of thing as well, because the same goes for, there were some trans and non-binary people with Tourette syndrome who I interviewed. Similar thing goes for them, kind of transphobic and homophobic slurs as tics. They were quite concerned about hearing those sometimes. And yeah, so there's a lot of kind of intersectional consideration that hasn't really been had in other literature. And so that's kind of what I'm hoping to work on kind of moving forwards with that. But Yeah. So again, it's just another case of I do a master's, it's too big. I do a PhD, it's too big. There's too many things. So I guess I'm trying to think about, yeah, what comes next in terms of, yeah, being able to actually gather that data and do something with it.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of different,
Yeah.
a lot of different topics that you could pursue because this really hasn't been looked at from a research perspective before. Wow. And that's great that you're also highlighting the importance of intersectionality with identities and cultures and geographic location, because that's another thing that's just missing from, I guess, research in general, like historically, has been missing a lot of views from many, many people, particularly of global majority. And you're still working with the University of Sheffield. Are you able to kind of promote those more inclusive research methods or sort of use them in your own research or continuing to do that?
Yeah, for sure. So, yeah, for context, at the University of Sheffield, the project I'm specifically working on at the moment is, looking at anti-ableist research cultures more generally. So it's not like a Tourette syndrome specific project that I'm working on, but within that, I am looking at kind of, innovating inclusive ways to do research, both for participants of research, but also for researchers themselves. And also actually, thinking about how do we inclusively teach people how to do inclusive research, which sounds a little bit meta, I suppose, but and I'm really lucky in that my department and my managers are really, really encouraging of me kind of, planning this other kind of Tourette syndrome research as well. And, there's a very big focus within the department that I'm in on kind of career development, because the way academia kind of works is, at least in the UK, is that most of the time you are working on fixed term contracts, project by project basis. So there's an expiry date on your employment with no room to extend for the most part. And so you're kind of jumping between lots of different projects, trying to put together kind of application funding at the same time. So a lot going on, but there's definitely direct kind of links and crossovers between my like personal scholarship is what we refer to it as, and my actual like employed work as well. And I'm hoping that that's all going to come together at some point and culminate in some kind of contract that is a nice length of time. I hope that answers the question. I've gone on a tangent, which is, as you know, is very much my thing.
Yeah, definitely. And are you also designing a course for researchers on inclusivity? That's really cool.
Yeah, so within that project, one of the outputs that was kind of expected and was kind of listed on the funding application was specifically the kind of designing of an inclusive research methods course for kind of postgraduate researchers and PhD students at the University of Sheffield to take. And that it was, very flexible. It's left very open to interpretation what that means. Realistically, in the timeline that we've got, that's not going to be kind of like a credited module that is like integrated into specific degree programs, but we're currently in the process of collecting data and kind of interviewing people and doing these creative workshops again, actually, with people from different faculties, from like engineering to education to fine art. All these people are coming together to kind of chat about what inclusive research methods might mean to them. And then from there, I guess we're probably going to end up kind of creating some resources, whether that's kind of like a series of videos or kind of materials for people to access on websites, or, a couple of training workshops that we might deliver to people. That's still kind of up for debate and is very much dependent on what participants think would be the most useful for them. But we're kind of like in the middle of the data collection, so that could go in any direction at the moment. Mm-hmm. And we're working with a great disabled persons organization. There's a collaborator called Speak Up Self-Advocacy, which is like a Sheffield-based disability advocacy charity, basically. And they are also coming in and informing our research as well, because, it's in a kind of disability-specific like institute that the research is based. And so realistically, lots of people are going to be collaborating with partner organizations, and so we want to make sure we're thinking about what's inclusive for these charities and other organizations as well. So lots of moving parts, and that's just one area of a much bigger project as well. But yes, all that to say that we're trying to come up with some kind of course as a part of that role that I'm employed on top of looking at kind of accessible events organization as well, which is a whole other aspect. But yeah.
Oh, wow. That's great. Yeah, that's really needed. So yeah, thank you for doing all the work on that and helping other people to get better at creating accessible events and more inclusive research, because yeah, that's really important. So
for
really,
sure.
really awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, well, Daniel, your research is really fascinating, and it sounds like you're really just getting started, and there's so much, there's so many more topics to look into. How can people, if they want to get in touch with you to learn more about the type of research you're doing or the work you're doing, how would they do that?
Yeah, so it depends on like social medias that people use. The only one that I'm really on at the moment is Blue Sky. So if you just type in Daniel P. Jones, I'll probably come up. But if you type that into Google and then just Tourette syndrome, my work usually comes up. And there's some old emails on there, but my most up-to-date one is whatever the Sheffield one is. And I'm always happy to chat to people about research methods more generally speaking, or Tourette syndrome specific stuff. Like I said, we're kind of in the early stages, both in this research methods project, but also in my own kind of scholarship on Tourette's, of putting together like funding applications and things. So yeah, I'm always open to chatting to people and to just I guess connecting with the Tourettic community as well, and I guess other stakeholders who are interested in Tourette's, and to try and progress things a little bit further and hopefully a bit faster so that it can kind of catch up a little bit with everything else.
That's awesome. Yeah. And again, the research topics are really exciting, because I would think that when people think of Tourette's research, it's probably, very, cure-based or like tick suppression based. And it's like, well,
oh, definitely.
There's a place for that, but there are also adults who need community and need support like now. So like, how do we do something that's affirming of, the experience you're going through right now? Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's where my kind of human geography background has really had an influence. I think the majority of research into Tourette's is being done from like a psychology, like a kind of clinical perspective, like psychiatry, psychology, I guess pediatric medicine specifically a lot of the time. And so there's a very different focus in these kind of medical spaces than there is in these like social science and humanities spaces. And again, what I kind of am trying to work towards, it's like you said, there's a time and a place, and that there is a need for these kinds of things and this research to be done in these medical ways, but there's also a need for the social aspect. And a lot of the time these kind of medical science and social science, when it comes to disability and Tourette syndrome specifically, they really butt heads and they don't collaborate, and they're always just at each other. And don't get me wrong, I think there's an awful lot of kind of bad practice out there and papers that are really stigmatizing, like to be honest, on both sides. And I think what I am trying to do in the way that I'm moving forwards with my research on Tourette's is try and find a way to bring these two together and, basically bring all the best parts of both and kind of have the nuance of like the social science, but with, other kind of like, physiological expertise and things of medical science. And so that's what I'm really wrestling with at the moment, and where I guess I'm trying to push for something new and a bit more collaborative, and that basically the focus is centering Tourettic people rather than talking bad about another discipline.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Really important stuff. So yeah, Daniel, as we close out the interview today, is there anything else that you'd like our listeners to know, or anything that they can help or support you with?
There's nothing specific to plug, I suppose. I guess other than, the research that I've got going on at the moment. Again, if you are interested in Tourette syndrome or kind of creative and inclusive research methods, if you just type in Daniel P. Jones, University of Sheffield or Tourette syndrome or creative methods, there'll be some things that come up. For the most part, everything is open access, but if people want to get in touch with me, they can email me, or I've got a website as well that kind of touches more on like the creative practitioner side of the work that I do as well, which is just danielpjones.com. And yeah, you're welcome to contact me via there, but inbox is always open, always happy to have a natter, I suppose. And also, I'm just really curious to hear about any other research going on in Tourette syndrome, specifically if it's being done by Tourettic people themselves, whether, you're in a university setting or outside of it. We're trying to, working on something at the moment, trying to bring Tourettic people together who are engaged in these kind of, I guess, this knowledge production and kind of writing around Tourette's. With, I guess, I hope to kind of set up some kind of network and encourage more collaboration. So I guess if that is relevant or if that applies to anyone listening, then please do get in touch. I'd love to chat.
Yeah, well, that's awesome. Yeah, well, Daniel, thank you so much for being a guest on my show today. I really enjoyed learning about your own personal story with Tourette's and all the great research you're doing. So thanks again for being on my show.
No, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, it's been great to chat. Thanks.